There is one active rare earth mine in the United States. One. It sits in the Mojave Desert, 60 miles outside Las Vegas. It produces materials that go into F-35 fighter jets, Virginia-class submarines, Tesla motors, and wind turbines. It is the only facility of its kind on American soil. For years, that mine shipped everything it dug out of the ground to China for processing because China was the only country with the infrastructure to handle it. Read that again. The United States' only rare earth mine, a facility the Pentagon now calls critical to national security, was, until 2025, a supplier to the Chinese industrial complex it was supposed to be independent from. When the trade war forced that relationship to end, the US was left with a mine, no processing chain, and an adversary that controls 90% of the global supply of the materials it desperately needs. The response was unprecedented. The Department of Defense became a shareholder. This is the story of how America lost an entire industry and what it's actually going to cost to get it back. Rare earth elements are in almost every piece of advanced technology you interact with. The electric motor in a Tesla, the guidance system in an F-35, the speakers in your phone, the turbines generating wind power. They are not optional components. There are no easy substitutes. And for decades, one country has controlled their supply chain from the ground up. China mines around 60% of the world's rare earths. But mining is almost beside the point. What matters is what happens next: separating, refining, and manufacturing. China controls over 90% of that downstream process, and around 90% of the high-performance permanent magnets that come out the other end. The reason that matters is the nature of modern industry. Rare earth magnets are not a niche defense input. They are embedded in the civilian economy at scale. Every electric vehicle motor requires them. Every direct drive wind turbine, every hard drive, every MRI machine, every industrial robot. The dependency isn't theoretical. It's built into the production lines of every major manufacturer in the Western world. In April 2025, Beijing made that leverage visible. When the US imposed tariffs, China retaliated, not with counter-tariffs, but with export restrictions on rare earth elements. Automakers outside China started halting production lines. Ford, GM. The supply chain didn't just wobble, it broke, and the US had no fallback, because the fallback had been gutted, decades earlier, by the same country now weaponizing it. To understand how that happened, you have to go back to a desert in California, Mountain Pass, California. Discovered in 1949, by the 1960s it was supplying most of the world's rare earth oxides, for color televisions, fluorescent lighting, early magnets. For decades, it was the anchor of a global industry. America didn't just participate in rare earths, it dominated them. Then China entered the market. Beginning in the 1980s, Beijing made a strategic decision. Deng Xiaoping said it directly. The Middle East has oil. China has rare earths. The government backed the sector with cheap loans, state investment, and loose environmental rules. It drove export prices so low that foreign competitors couldn't survive on market economics alone. Mountain Pass closed in 2002, not because the ore ran out, because American production couldn't compete with artificially suppressed Chinese prices. The US had handed the industry over without a fight, or more precisely, without noticing it was a fight at all. This is the part of the story that tends to get glossed over. Rare earths aren't actually rare. They exist in substantial quantities across many countries, including the US. The bottleneck was never geology. It was processing. China didn't just build mines. It built an entire industrial ecosystem. The chemical plants that separate ore into individual elements, the refineries that convert them into metals, the factories that turn those metals into magnets. Each step requires specialized knowledge, infrastructure, and scale that took China decades to develop. By the time the rest of the world noticed what had happened, China held the entire chain, from ground to finished product. A company called Molycorp tried to revive Mountain Pass in the early 2000s. It raised billions, rebuilt the mine, and attempted to build separation capacity on American soil. It failed. In 2015, Molycorp filed for bankruptcy, and the mine flooded, literally. 30 million gallons of groundwater pooled at the bottom of the pit while the assets sat idle. In 2017, a Chicago hedge fund manager named Jim Litinsky saw an opportunity in the wreckage. He'd been tracking rare earths since watching a 60-minute segment on China's dominance. He started quietly buying up Molycorp's distressed debt, became the largest creditor, and when bankruptcy proceedings ended, he acquired the mine for approximately $20 million, a fraction of what Molycorp had spent. MP Materials was born. But here's the part that rarely gets mentioned in the triumphant version of this story. To get the company off the ground, Litinsky needed a customer. And the only viable customer, with the processing infrastructure to handle raw concentrate, was China. MP Materials signed an offtake agreement with Shanghai Resources, a company listed on the Shanghai Stock Exchange with ties to the Chinese state. Under the deal, Shanghai purchased essentially all of Mountain Pass's rare earth concentrate and shipped it to China for processing. The only active rare earth mine in the United States was, functionally, a Chinese supply chain input. That arrangement held until April 2025, when the trade war made it commercially and politically untenable. MP halted all shipments to China, and suddenly the company that had spent years rebuilding the mine had to accelerate its entire downstream build-out, separation, refining, magnets, without the customer it had relied on from the beginning, which is where the Pentagon comes in. The July 2025 deal is not a simple investment, it's a structured industrial intervention with four interlocking components. First, $400 million in convertible preferred equity, making the DoD MP's largest shareholder with roughly a 15% stake. Second, a $150 million government loan specifically to expand heavy rare earth separation capabilities at Mountain Pass, the harder, more strategically sensitive part of the process. Third, a 10-year commitment to purchase 100% of the output from a new magnet manufacturing facility, referred to internally as the 10X facility, planned for groundbreaking in 2026 and first production in 2028. Fourth, a price floor. If global neodymium-praseodymium prices fall below $110 per kilogram, as they might if China floods the market, as it has done before, the US government makes up the difference. That last mechanism is the most significant. It is a direct response to the specific tactic that killed Mountain Pass twice. China's strategy wasn't secrecy or military force, it was economics. Drive prices low enough, for long enough, and your competitors go bankrupt. The price floor says that playbook no longer works. Even if Chinese producers flood the market, this facility stays open. For the first time, the US has structured a rare earth investment that is explicitly designed to survive Chinese countermeasures. There are two structural tensions in this deal that don't get enough airtime. The first is the Shanghai problem. MP Materials spent its formative years, from 2017 until 2025, dependent on a Chinese state-linked company to buy its product. That's not a criticism of the business decision, it was the only path to viability. But it means the company now positioned as the cornerstone of American rare earth independence built its operational foundation on the Chinese supply chain it's supposed to replace. The separation is real now, but it was recent, forced, and incomplete. Shanghai still holds warrants and commercial relationships that take years to fully unwind. If you're building a national security strategy on a company, that company's history matters. The second tension is heavier. The Pentagon deal is designed primarily around light rare earths, neodymium and praseodymium, the elements used in standard permanent magnets. Those matter enormously, but the more acute national security vulnerability lies in the heavy rare earths, dysprosium and terbium, which make magnets capable of withstanding high temperatures. That's what goes into F-35 actuators, Virginia-class submarines, and next-generation drone systems. Without them, the most advanced weapons platforms in the US arsenal can't be built. For those elements, China's grip is almost total. Benchmark Mineral Intelligence projects that China and Myanmar will still control close to 80% of global dysprosium and terbium supply in 2031. The $150 million loan for heavy rare earth separation at Mountain Pass is a start, but analysts are skeptical about the timeline, and the geology at Mountain Pass makes heavy separation harder than at comparable Chinese deposits. The deal addresses the problem. It does not solve the hardest version of it. Step back from the deal itself, and what you're looking at is something larger: the return of American industrial policy. For roughly 3 decades after the Cold War, the dominant assumption in Washington was that markets allocate resources efficiently, that supply chains optimize themselves, and that it didn't matter where things were made as long as they were cheap. That assumption is now visibly, publicly, expensively wrong. The MP Materials deal didn't emerge from a new philosophy, it emerged from a crisis. China's export restrictions in April 2025 forced a response. But the structure of that response, equity stakes, price floors, decade-long offtake commitments, is something different from emergency procurement. It's a template, and it's already being replicated. Within months of the MP deal closing, the Trump administration announced Project Vault, a $12 billion initiative to build a U.S. strategic critical minerals reserve. A critical minerals ministerial convened 55 nations to formalize a preferential trade zone for strategic materials. Bilateral deals followed, with Australia, Ukraine, and others all structured around the same principle. Secure the supply chain before you need it, not after. What's significant is not just what the US is doing, but why it took this long. The rare earth vulnerability was documented in government reports going back to 2010, when China briefly restricted exports to Japan following a maritime dispute. Japan responded by investing heavily in alternative sources and recycling technology. The US largely did not. It took a full trade war, production line shutdowns, and a visible national security emergency to produce the political will for a structural response. And Beijing's own behavior is accelerating that process. China's export restrictions were intended as leverage, but leverage used too aggressively teaches the other side that the dependency is too dangerous to maintain. Every time China weaponizes rare earths, it validates the case for spending whatever it takes to build an alternative supply chain. The more pressure Beijing applies, the faster the capital flows west. China may have built a trap and then helped its rivals find the door. None of this means the plan works on the timeline being advertised. The 10X magnet facility is planned for 2028. Large, complex industrial facilities, the kind that haven't been built in the US in decades, routinely run late and over budget. The workforce that knows how to operate them at scale largely doesn't exist yet on American soil. And even if everything goes to plan, analysts estimate that all rare earth refineries being built outside China combined will only reach about half of China's current production capacity by 2030. The price floor protects MP from Chinese market manipulation. It doesn't protect against execution risk, permitting delays, or the sheer technical difficulty of rebuilding a processing infrastructure from near zero in under a decade. This is not a solved problem. It is a problem being taken seriously for the first time in a generation. So, why did the Pentagon buy 15% of a mining company? Because it had no choice. Because the alternative, continuing to depend on an adversary for materials that go into every advanced weapon system and every clean energy technology, had become strategically indefensible. What the MP Materials deal actually represents is not a victory, it's a diagnosis. America spent 30 years optimizing its economy for efficiency and outsourced the industrial capacity it now urgently needs. Rebuilding it requires the kind of patient, structured state intervention that the US hasn't practiced since the Cold War. The Pentagon knows how to build aircraft carriers. It's learning, again, how to build supply chains. Whether it remembers fast enough is the question that will define the next decade of this competition.